Today, hello everyone. To be finishing the part on patellar instability that we had started last week. Last week we had seen a bit about the epidemiology, the bony factors, soft tissue factors that lead to patellar instability, along with classifications and radiological parameters that have been described so far to quantify, describe, and define patellar instability. So today we would be discussing about the management about patellar instability. This has been very nicely described in this paper by David DeJour, wherein he has given a very nice algorithm to for the management of patellar instability. So in he has classified it as into painful patellar syndrome, potential patellar dislocation, objective patellar dislocation, wherein in painful patellar syndrome, you are going to have all your symptoms of patellar instability. And in potential patellar dislocations, you can also elicit the signs of patellar instability. So, essentially, for both of these types of conditions, the treatment is conservative. So, what in conservative management, what exactly is to be done is you have to get imaging done, you have to review all your films, you have to rule out osteochondral fractures of the patella or the femoral condyles, and MRI is only indicated in skeletally immature children to rule out osteochondral fractures. Immobilization per se is not required. We can give light braces, patches for each week to reduce some pain and swelling. As immobilization has been known to cause knee stiffness, the current trend is to not give any immobilization, just a removable light brace or a crutch for 1 week, and then we have to get on with your knee rehab. If there is a lipohematosis that is present, we have to consider arthrocentesis to relieve the pressure and the pain. The goals of rehab essentially are to restore the full range of motion of the knee, strengthen the quadriceps, stretch the lateral structures, and promote medial sided healing. There are some papers which suggest which compare early repair or reconstruction of the MPFL with conservative management. However, none of these papers have been able to quantify whether there is a lot of benefit of the early repair or reconstruction versus conservative treatment. So the current consensus is conservative management. And we have to reevaluate the child at 45 days. You have to get all the imaging done, assess all the anatomic risk factors, and discuss the risk of recurrence of the patellar dislocation, as it is for 40% of them do redislocate. And you have to discuss the prognosis with the patient, and if any anatomical risk factors are present, maybe we could try counseling them regarding what could be the further surgical management regarding the same. So this is about the conservative management for a first dislocator. Next, if the number of dislocations are less than 2 to 3 and conservative treatment does fail, or if the number of dislocations are more than 2 to 3, then we could go offer operative treatment. So in the form of MPFL reconstruction. Typically, this is done arthroscopically. These days, I would be just telling it in brief. MPFL reconstruction works via a check-green effect. Multiple fixation techniques have been described, multiple graphs have been used, and a lot of papers describe a lot of many techniques, but no single technique has been proven superior over the other. Some important things to take into consideration are you shouldn't really combine a realignment procedure with an MPFL reconstruction, and if a major malalignment does exist, it should not be done in isolation. MPFL reconstruction should not be done in isolation. So stage procedures is the norm. So ideal indications for isolated MPFL reconstruction are a low-grade trochlear dysplasia, DeJour type A. We had seen that in the last class, the classification of DeJour. I will be elaborating it further in the slides that come ahead. Normal or a mildly elevated TT-TG ratio and absence of patella alta for doing a MPFL reconstruction. So MPFL is the primary soft tissue restraint to lateral patellar translation. Autografts or allografts can be used. Autografts commonly used are SEMITI. Well, sometimes some centers do use quadriceps tendon, adductor tendon as well. Allografts very few centers in India where they use non-irradiated SEMIT or Tiban tendon. And tenodesis is an old technique that used to be followed, but it is non-anatomic and has a very high failure rate. So this is a very important radiological parameter, which is seen on the C-arm intraoperatively when we when we go ahead with the formation of the femoral tunnel for the MPFL reconstruction. It is called the Shortle's point. It is identified just proximal to the posterior extent of the Blumenstein's line, 1 mm anterior to the posterior cortex and 2.5 mm distal to the medial femoral condyle origin. So this is where you have to make your femoral tunnel. Uh, I would be talking in briefly about MPFL reconstruction, generally done in supine position. You have to assess the passive instability, which is defined as a soft or absent endpoint to lateral patellar glide, which is seen at full extension, and then dislocation with the knee in 30 degrees of flexion. You have to make a 3 centimeter vertical incision over the pes anserinus between the tibial anterior crest and posterior medial border of the tibia. You harvest the semity. It is whip stitch using a absorbable suture, and it is harvested with a closed tendon stripper. It's like all routine. Then minimum length of the graft that you need is 240 mm. When it is looped around, it's 120 mm. The thickness, as we see when we do ACL reconstructions, we look for 9 mm, 10 mm grafts, but that is not the case when it comes to MPFL reconstruction, because the biomechanical properties of the graft and the restraint that the ACL or PCL have to provide is way higher when it comes to when we compare it with the MPFL graft. So the graft is folded in half, and you put a non-absorbable braided suture, and then one of the two, then each free end is passed through the patellar tunnels to form a baseball stitch. Then after harvesting the graft, you have to make two incisions. One is the anterior patellar incision, second is the medial femoral incision. The medial one is centered over the medial epicondyle. It is dissected between the layer 2 and the layer 3, and the graft that we do take lies between the layer 2 and 3. If the layer 3, that is the capsule, you tend to open it. Like if it gets opened by fault, then you have to take care to close it later to avoid postoperative knee stiffness or arthrofibrosis. So when it comes to the formation of the patellar tunnel, you have to form two transverse tunnels which are drilled in the proximal thirds of the patella. So you divide the patella equator and above it. So the proximal tunnel is going to lie halfway between the equator and the superior border, and the distal tunnel is going to lie just above the equator. So there's nothing really in the distal half of the patella. That is the direction of the patellar tunnel. And your drill, when you make, you can use a 3.5 drill to make the superior tunnel and a 4.5 mm to make the distal tunnel. Your drill should always be parallel to the table. That is between the maximum thickness of the patella. Then, when from the edges where the tendon is going to enter, you have to curate it out and make it smoother. And the femoral tunnel insertion, I told you about the Shortle's point. So that is marked on the fluoroscopy. And from there, you draw it around, you confirm the site and you make the femoral tunnel there. Then first you pass the femoral socket. You make a 7 to 8 mm femoral socket, goes to a depth of about 2.5 centimeters using a reamer. Then you have to pass the looped end of the graft into the socket and fix it using a 7 mm biointerference screw. The patellar graft is going to have two limbs. Both of them are going to be fixed using suture anchors with the knee in 30 degrees flexion. In this position, you have to confirm that the patella is tracking centrally and the graft should not be tight, should not be very slack. Here, each limb is again folded back upon itself and sutured. If you do find some native MPFL fibers, they have to be sutured over the graft. Then you have to, this is the image of the two guide pins that pass through the patellar tunnels. Then this is where you suture the graft over itself in the patellar tunnel. And this is a diagrammatic image of how the MPFL graft is tunneled between the two layers of the medial retinaculum. This is the biointerference screw. These are the two suture anchors. This is another image showing the same. You can see the interference screw and the suture anchors. This is the Shortall's point. Okay, we are done with that. Next, with MPFL, you have to get, we are obviously going to get all imaging done. And with that, if we do find that there is some trochlear dysplasia, uh, we have to classify the type of trochlear dysplasia into types A, B, C, or D. Type A generally does not require any extra procedure that is to be done. Here you can see that there is only the crossing sign. That is the intersection of the trochlear floor and the lateral femoral condyle. Second, you have type B, trochlear dysplasia, wherein you see the presence of a supratrochlear spur along with the crossing sign and a flat trochlea. This is type B of de Jure. Type C, supratrochlear spur is a bony spur that is present at the proximal end of the trochlea, as we can see here. In type C, we have a crossing sign with a double contour that we see, which is because the medial femoral condyle is smaller, you can see that there are two images here that they superimpose on each other. So that is a double contour. Along with that, it has a convex trochlea. So this is type C. Then coming to type D, there is a supratrochlear spur as is there in type B, along with the crossing sign of types A and B and double contour sign of type C, with a cliff pattern of the trochlea. So all this is important in what we do further with the type. We classify the type of trochlear dysplasia, and then this is the type A generally does not require any surgical modification of the trochlear groove. Types B and type C are best treated with sulcus deepening, Lyon sulcus deepening trochleoplasty because of the presence of this prominent supratrochlear spur. Um, yes. Then, so what is sulcus deepening trochleoplasty? It is going to reshape the trochlea. It is going to form a central groove with new medial lateral facets. It is going to reduce the patellofemoral joint reaction force by removing the supratrochlear spur, and it is going to decrease the TTTG distance. A type C treatment is still debated. The suggested options given in literature are tibial tubercle distalization, lateral retinacular release, and lateral facetal elevation. So I would start describing sulcus deepening trochleoplasty. It has been given very nicely in this paper in very 10 steps. So I would be elaborating more on these 10 steps. So beginning with the exposure, a midline incision is taken. We take either a mid-vastus or a transquadriceps approach. Mid-vastus is preferred. Then medial retinaculum is incised, and the VMO vastus medialis is split proximally. Then you do assessment of the trochlea and planning of the trochlea. The native trochlear groove is marked with a sterile pen, and then you draw two additional divergent lines as shown in the figure here, starting at the notch and directed proximally outwards. These represent the new medial and lateral facets. Then you have to determine the TTTG ratio. So, for example, the normal value is between 10 to 30. More than 20 is pathological. By doing this sulcus deepening trochleoplasty, we can reduce the TTTG ratio by 5 to 10 mm. Then second, you have to remove, incise and elevate the peritrochlear synovium and the periosteum. Then you have to resect the supratrochlear spur using an osteotome and expose the anterior femoral cortex. Then you have to create an osteochondral flap using a 5 mm drill bit as shown in these images here, and you have to create convergent tunnels. It is created with a drill bit of 2.5 mm, and you have to maintain a distance of 2 mm between two drill holes. And then you have to remove a thickness of about 5 mm osteochondral flap. After this, you have to remove, using a burr, you have to remove the cancellous bone, and then you have to create a V-shaped bed which is flush with the anterior femoral cortex, removing the supratrochlear spur. You have to preserve the osteochondral flap, and you have to avoid thermal damage as well. Then the subchondral part of the osteochondral flap is osteotomized, and which is angled at 45 degrees to avoid a trochlear fracture. Then you have to adjust the medial and lateral facets. like reduce the medial and lateral facets. And if the lateral facet just remains very flat, then you can use a bone graft to elevate it. And that is typically indicated in type D of de jure trochlear dysplasia. So, and you have to fix it with sub sutures, observable bio suture anchor anterior, which is placed anterior to the notch. Then you have to assess the lateral structures. If there is a persistent lateral non-reducible tilt, then a lateral retinacular lengthening is preferred. Is to be done. In this case, which I'm showing it, there was a need for MPFL reconstruction as well. So that is performed after the tibial tubercle distalization. Like I had described when I was talking about MPFL reconstruction also, that if a bony procedure is needed, that is to be done prior to the reconstruction of the MPFL. Then all the layers are sutured anatomically, and that is sulcus deepening trochleoplasty. Then I will, so we finished your type B and D, sulcus deepening trochleoplasty. Sorry. Oh. So now coming to cases with patella alta along with objective patellar more than 3 dislocations, wherein MPFL reconstruction is needed, and along with that, if there's patella alta, we would be going on ahead with a tibial tubercle distalization. I will be talking about medialization, which is done for type distalization slash medialization for type C also. Distalization comes here and here, medialization comes here and here. So I will just be going like that. So for patella alta, the factors that de Jure has taken into consideration for this paper are Chatham-Ducham's index and sagittal patellofemoral engagement index. So I had spoken about them last time, but I will just brush up upon it in case it got a lot of values. So Chatham-Ducham's index is measured on a lateral radiograph or can be done on a sagittal CT of the knee or an MRI. If taken in radiography, the knee should be flexed at an angle of 30 degrees. But in Catton's Duchamp's original paper, they have taken with the knee flexion from 20 degrees to 80 degrees. So here the standardized value 30-degree knee flexion. So here it is a ratio of 1/2, 1 being distance between the anterior angle of the tibial plateau to the most inferior part of the patellar articular surface, and 2 being the patellar articular surface length. Chatham-Ducham's index is A by B, wherein the normal range is 0.6 to 1.3. Patella alta, if the value is more than 1.3, then you say that it's patella alta. If it is less than 0.6, it's patella baja. Second is sagittal patellofemoral engagement. Okay, so this is a measure of the functional engagement of the patella in the trochlea, in the sagittal plane. This serves as a supplementary tool to assess the patellar height. So here, this is a very new index that has come. It's not very new, but in treatment algorithms, it has been taken into consideration very recently. So to start with, you have to take 2 cuts of the patella. In cut 1, you have to make the cut with the longest patellar cartilage. This is the patellar length. This is PL. In cut 2, you have to take the part with the most maximal trochlear cartilage, and that is PL. TL. Then you have to divide the trochlear length. So divide the trochlear length by the patellar length, and then you get the sagittal patellofemoral engagement index. So this helps in identifying cases where there is inadequate engagement despite the absence of patella alta. So if the engagement is inadequate and there is no patella alta, how do you quantify? Is by calculating the sagittal patellofemoral engagement index. Now I would be talking about tibial tubercle distalization. And as we have already seen that we have performed it when the Catton-Ducham's index is more than 1.2 or the SPE is less than 0.5, 0.45. The goal of the procedure is to normalize the CDI. I would be calling Catton-Deschamps since the index as CDI from now on to 1 to improve the patellar engagement with the trochlear groove during extension. So how do you calculate how much distalization is to be done? You have to calculate the CDI of the patient. Like suppose the two limbs of the measurement that I showed before, 1 and 2. One is 34 and two is 26. And if you divide both of them, you should get 1 technically. So here you can see that the difference between 26 and 34 is 8. So the amount of distalization that you do need is 8 mm. Okay. So what this does is going to allow earlier engagement of the patella in the trochlear groove. As we know that once the patella enters the trochlear groove, it will have a lot of bony restraints acting on it instead of just the soft tissue ones, and therefore it will have enhanced stability. So how this I have described the surgical technique very, very briefly, so I will just be brushing upon it. It is typically done in supine position. You have to examine the patellar tracking. You have to assess if there's a lateral dislocation, patella alta is there. You have to mark the bony landmarks. You have to plan the incision, which is generally a 7 to 8 centimeters incision, anterolateral to the tibial tubercle. Then some centers do try and get a arthroscopical visualization. As you can see, there are some scopy portals which have been made here, but that is not routinely needed. Then you have to raise the medial and lateral skin flaps, preserve the patellar tendon, and you have to protect the elevation of the anterior muscle, anterior compartment musculature, and preserve the patellar tendon. Second is marking and planning of the osteotomy. Typically, 1 centimeter of bone removal is done for distalization, and around a 7 centimeter flap, osteochondral flap, periosteal flap is elevated for the osteotomy. You have to place, this is the outline of the osteotomy that has been done with the marker, as you can see here on the tibia. Then you have to place two guide pins, which are at a 40-degree angle from medial to lateral. Then you have to use a sagittal saw to complete the osteotomy from distal to the proximal. You have to avoid going posterior because you have the neurovascular bundles, and you have to be very wary of the patellar tendon as well, which is in front. Then you have to extend the osteotomy proximally. You begin distally and you go proximally. You complete the osteotomy proximally. Then you pre-drill two screw holes for 4.5 mm titanium or whatever screws. Then you remove the distal bone and then you fix the osteotomy. You can translate the tibial tubercle 1 centimeter medial and 1 centimeter distal. For example, how much ever you want to distalize as per the calculation that I showed before. And you have to ensure that the screws are bicortical. You have to take fluoroscopy images and then you check the patellar tracking and the range of motion. So this is the brief overview of how we do a tibial tubercle distalization. Next, in the a la carte, we have tibial tubercle medialization, which is calculate the TTTG ratio in the CT if it is more than 20 mm and in MRI if it is more than 13 mm. This is what is needed. Okay. So what is CTTG ratio? We saw last time also. It is a linear measure of distance from the between the distances between the insertion of the patellar tendon on the tibial tuberosity and the trochlear groove. So normally the cutoff values, higher limit for CT is 20 mm, MRI 13 mm we saw. So TTTG, tibial tubercle anteromedialization is done and is indicated for excessive distance, and this is going to reduce the valgus force on the extensor mechanism. So the goal is to again normalize the TTTG distance. On CT it is 10 to 15, on MRI it is 3 to 8 to 13. Last time we had spoken about a new indicator to determine this called the TTPCL, and that value, if it is more than 24, we can say that this is a case that needs anteromedialization. So how to calculate how much medialization is to be done is you calculate the CT value of TTTG, which is 23 mm. The target should be 13. So medialization of around a centimeter would be needed for this case. So, and what to do with the secondary anatomical factors? There is essentially no surgical specific cutoffs or algorithms which have been given in the way they have been given for patellar instability. But if there's excessive femoral anteversion, we do a derotation osteotomy. Excessive tibial torsion, we do tibial derotation. And if there's excessive severe valgus deformity, which is pertaining, which is causing the instability, we go ahead with a tibial or a femoral osteotomy based on where the valgus is. So I would be describing briefly about tibial tubercle medialization as well, or anteromedialization, AMZ. This is also done in a supine position with tourniquet if preferred. Then you have to, the paratenon midline incision is taken, longitudinal 5 centimeters centered over the tibial tuberosity. Then paratenon is split from both the sides and visualization of the patellar tendon is done. Followed by the visualization of the patellar tendon is done, followed by the elevation of the anterolateral musculature from the anterolateral surface of the tibia. Then osteotomy is planned based on the TTTG ratio, the patellar tracking. Then the drill bits, as you can see, are inserted proximally and distally and which exit laterally, not posteriorly. Then these two drill bits are placed in the same plane to ensure that the osteotomy would be in a single plane. The drill bits are supposed to exit laterally. Then an osteotomy is done using a saw, which is made sure that it is parallel to the two guide pins that we have inserted. Unless there is a need for distalization, you tend to leave the distal periosteal hinge intact, and then you can just rotate the part of the proximal part of the osteotomized portion around the distal intact hinge. Then the tibial tuberosity, once the medial and lateral cortices have been cut, the osteotome is used to complete the osteotomy. Then you have to connect the osteotomy from medial and lateral. Then you have to complete the proximal osteotomy. Then the amount of shift is determined by the values of DDTG that we had taken prior to beginning the surgery. Then the fragment is medialized. Anterior fragment is mobilized anteriorly and medially, and then you have to that first the distal screw is inserted using a compression technique, and then the proximal screw is inserted. Typically 4.5 mm cortical screws are used with bicortical fixation. The direction has to be lateral to medial. Avoid posterior direction to not cause neurovascular injury. Washer is may or may not be needed, and in the end you have to do a fluoroscopy to confirm the screw position. This is a schematic representation of the tibial tubercle osteotomy, wherein about 1 centimeter of anteromedialization has been done and there is fixation using two bicortical screws. Next comes medial patellar tilt, for which lateral release is indicated. It is sorry, only if lateral release is indicated only if there is lateral clinical presence of lateral tightness. There is no radiological indicator. Initially, the patellar tilt angle used to be included in the algorithm, but later on it has been found that clinical judgment is far more superior when it comes for the need of lateral release. It can be performed open, like if you're doing any other open procedure, for example, a trochleoplasty or anteromedialization or a distalization, or if nothing else, then you can do it arthroscopically also. I have described the arthroscopic technique here. So it is typically done using the superolateral portal, using something called a coblation device for the release. The knee is held in full extension. Then the release sequences, you start from the superior pore of the patella, go 1 centimeter lateral to the patella and avoid injury to the vastus lateralis. And you open the layers in this layer, synovial membrane, joint capsule, superficial fascia, coming from inside out. Then alternative approach to this is either use a anterolateral portal and it's performed proximal to distal. You have to avoid injury to superior genicular, lateral genicular artery. Then after the release has been done, you have to assess clinically. Then the lateral patellar edge angle, that patella should lift by around 30 to 40 degrees. And you should do the patellar glide test and see that 1 to 2 quadrants of glide has to be present. And you have to assess the patellar tracking from 0 to 90 degrees of flexion. And if other procedures are needed, like we spoke, MPFL is needed, trochleoplasty is needed, and all of those, then LRR, like lateral retinacular release, has to be done first. So this is like a schematic diagram showing that the retinaculum was tight and the patella was decentered, and upon releasing the retinaculum, the patella is now centered again in the trochlear groove. So talking about realignment procedures, uh, there is no absolute indication that has been defined for the need of a particular procedure for a particular condition. All of them have been addressed separately. For example, if there is a valgus malalignment in a skeletally immature child, you do a temporary medial 8-plate hemiepiphysiodesis, or in a skeletally immature child, you do a distal femoral osteotomy or a tibial, depending on where the valgus is. And the aim is to neutralize or reduce the Q angle by correcting the valgus deformity. Then trochleoplasty has been shown to have favorable outcomes in patients with high-grade trochlear dysplasia, but in skeletally immature patients, it is not done. But we are talking about recurrent patellar instability, and it is typically seen during peri-adolescence. So I have just added this point here. Distal alignment procedures in cases of lateralized patellar tendon. Um, they are of when there is critical lateral malalignment, then these procedure indicative. Where in skeletally mature patients, you can do the procedures which I have described. But if there is a skeletally immature child, then a Rue Goldway procedure is preferred to avoid interference with the open physis. But I think all of this has to be described uh, in congenital or fixed dislocations, uh, like in a different topic, because this we are just discussing about adolescent children. Then comes the postoperative rehab. So phase one is protect and early mobilization, pain control, swelling reduction, patellar mobilization. This is rehab after surgery. Then you have to begin quadriceps reactivation at 0 to 2 weeks. And then second phase comes with you have progressive, you have to increase in the range of motion, and then you have to get them muscle control by hip strengthening, core exercises, and quadriceps strengthening. You have to wean off the brace as the quadriceps function improves. Then at 6 to 12 weeks, you start with closed chain exercises, gait normalization, gluteal and core strength. Phase 4 is functional training, sport specific drills, agility work. Then phase 5, or after 6 months, when there's full range of motion, there's symmetrical strength in both the legs, and their successful single hop leg tests, single hop tests are positive, and then you can go for contact sports at 6 to 9 months. The common problems of rehabilitation after patellofemoral instability injury are quadriceps inhibition, fear of re-injury, stiffness if ROM is not initiated in the earlier weeks of rehab, patellar maltracking, patellar swelling or effusion, delayed return to sport, which can either be due to weak neuromuscular control or psychological factors, and overcompensation injuries. So, to summarize and conclude about the a la carte concept, it is a tailored surgical plan for each patient. Surgical options include MPFL reconstruction, trochleoplasty, tubercle osteotomy, which can either be a medialization, anteromedialization, distalization, lateral retinacular release, or lengthening, derotational osteotomy in select cases. MPFL is the first line treatment for isolated instability without major bony abnormalities. It is combined with bony procedures when other risk factors are present. Trochleoplasty indicated in high-grade trochlear dysplasias, typically type B and D. It deepens the trochlear groove and enhances patellar tracking. Tubercle osteotomy is medialization for increased TTTG distance and distalization for patella alta. Additional considerations: derotation osteotomy for torsional deformities, femoral anteversion more than 25, for example, and a multidisciplinary approach in cases of syndromic or complex cases. So, a multifactorial analysis of the patient profile is very essential, and you can get a individualized and effective treatment approach to the patient if we do consider all of these factors. So if we do have better planning, we do tend to get better outcomes also.